The Interstellar Combat Academy on Station Helios 9 occupied a position of such prestigious irrelevance that it managed to be simultaneously the most sought-after military institution in 7 sectors, and completely useless in actual warfare. This was, of course, by design. The galaxy's various empires had discovered centuries ago that young warriors from different species mixing in actual combat situations tended to create what the diplomatic corps euphemistically called regrettable interstellar incidents. Better to let them posture, compete, and occasionally hospitalize each other in a controlled academic environment where the worst outcome was a strongly worded letter from someone's embassy. The station itself was a monument to excessive engineering. A rotating wheel habitat large enough to house 15,000 students, staff, and the small army of medical personnel required to keep them alive. It hung in the neutral zone between the Kraythen Empire and the Vorrax Collective, which was rather like positioning a kindergarten between 2 particularly aggressive wolf packs and hoping for the best. The architecture favored what designers called intimidation classical. Lots of sharp angles, dramatic lighting, and corridors wide enough that species measuring anywhere from 4 to 12 feet tall could swagger down them without bumping into each other. Which they did. Constantly. Swagger, that is. The Academy's student body represented the galaxy's self-proclaimed warrior elite, a designation that somehow excluded the 43 species who'd actually won their last conflicts, in favor of the 17 species who talked about war constantly. The Kraythen dominated the social hierarchy through the simple expedient of being massive, aggressive, and unwilling to entertain the notion that size might not directly correlate with combat effectiveness. They averaged 8 feet tall, possessed 4 arms ending in claws that could shred titanium, and had built an entire culture around the concept that might made right, which worked spectacularly until they encountered someone who disagreed and had the firepower to back it up. The Vorrax ran a close second in the campus pecking order, though their approach to intimidation leaned more toward cold calculation than raw aggression. They resembled what would happen if an octopus and a chess grandmaster had children who then decided to pursue careers in assassination. 6 tentacle limbs, beak-like mouths, and an unsettling habit of changing skin patterns to display complex mathematical equations when they were thinking through tactical problems. Their empire controlled resource-rich territories through a combination of strategic brilliance and the kind of patient, long-term planning that other species found deeply unnerving. Then came the Helkari, the Zrinth, the Quelon, and a dozen other species who'd earned their admission through military achievements, political connections, or in some cases, threats, thinly disguised as diplomatic negotiations. They filled the Academy's middle tiers, jockeying for position and forming alliances that would dissolve the moment someone's homeworld decided to invade someone else's homeworld, which happened with depressing regularity. At the bottom of this carefully stratified hierarchy sat the soft-worlders, a catch-all category for species from planets with gentle gravity, stable climates, and the kind of evolutionary history that produced scientists rather than warriors. The general consensus among the warrior species was that soft-worlders existed to provide technical support, maintain infrastructure, and occasionally serve as cautionary examples of what happened when a species chose books over battle axes. That humans had been dumped into this category upon their arrival 3 years ago surprised absolutely no one, least of all the humans themselves, who'd spent enough time in the galaxy to recognize a losing argument when they saw one. The combat theory and application classroom on level 7 exemplified everything the Academy stood for. Excessive, intimidating, and designed by someone who'd clearly never actually taught a class. The room could hold 60 students comfortably, which meant it held 40 in constant discomfort as various species tried to accommodate their vastly different body plans on furniture that seemed designed to annoy everyone equally. The floor was reinforced duracrete, because demonstrations had a habit of getting out of hand. The walls displayed rotating holographic projections of famous battles, none of which anyone actually studied because they were too busy establishing dominance hierarchies. Professor Krell, a Vorrax veteran who'd survived 3 major conflicts through a combination of tactical brilliance and being too mean to die, had long since given up on maintaining the kind of order described in the Academy's official handbook. His skin currently displayed a pattern that his species used to indicate resigned acceptance of chaos, which was his default state 15 minutes into any class period. He'd been lecturing on momentum exploitation in zero-gravity environments for the past 20 minutes, covering complex mathematical principles and their practical applications in ship-to-ship boarding actions. Approximately 7 students were actually listening. The other 33 were watching Drex. Drex was a Kraythen in the way that hurricanes were weather patterns, technically accurate, but missing the essential destructive nature of the phenomenon. He stood 8.5 feet of coiled muscle and casual cruelty, his forearms typically folded in a posture that managed to look both relaxed and threatening simultaneously. His scales held the deep, crimson coloring that Kraythen associated with warrior bloodlines, and he never let anyone forget it. His family controlled 3 sectors in the Kraythen Empire, which gave him the kind of confidence that came from knowing consequences were for other people. For the past 6 weeks, Drex had made combat theory his personal entertainment venue, disrupting lectures with commentary, challenging Professor Krell's tactical analyses with his species' preferred solution of hit it harder, and generally treating the classroom like his private court. His particular talent lay in identifying the students least able to fight back and making their lives systematically miserable, while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to avoid formal consequences. The Academy's administration took a remarkably philosophical view of bullying among warrior species, operating on the theory that if you couldn't handle verbal intimidation, you had no business in combat training. Today's target was obvious from the moment she'd walked in. Nora Chen sat 3 rows back, positioned between a Quellon, whose species found human body temperature uncomfortably warm, and a Helkari, who kept deliberately spreading his wing arms to crowd her space. She was one of 3 humans in a class of 40, and the only one who consistently showed up despite Drex's attention. The other 2 had started attending remotely after the 2nd week, which the Academy permitted, but everyone understood as social surrender. At 5'6" and maybe 130 soaking wet by Kraythen standards, Nora represented everything Drex found contemptible about soft-worlders. She took notes. She asked questions about tactical theory. She didn't posture or preen or participate in the elaborate social chess that dominated Academy life. Worse, she seemed entirely unimpressed by his displays of dominance, which Drex found more infuriating than any direct challenge would have been. You couldn't defeat indifference by being more intimidating. He could, however, try. The key principle, Professor Krell was saying, his tentacles manipulating a holographic display of 2 ships grappling in 0G, is understanding that in the absence of gravity, all momentum is conserved. An opponent's mass becomes a weapon you can exploit if you understand the vectors involved. Assuming your opponent has mass worth mentioning, Drex interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of casual contempt that came from years of never being challenged. His 3 friends, Vortek, Krax, and Zrel, laughed on cue. They always did. Some species are so light, they'd bounce off hull plating like insects. Professor Krell's skin rippled with irritation, but he continued. Mass is relative to the environment. In 0G, a smaller combatant with superior vector control can still be grabbed by one arm and thrown into a bulkhead, Drex finished, like a human, for instance. He turned in his seat now, making the target explicit. Tell me, Chen, In your species' limited combat experience, have you found being small and weak to be an advantage? The classroom's ambient noise dropped several decibels. This was a sport students understood, watching someone squirm under social pressure. Nora didn't look up from her tablet, stylus still moving across the screen as she annotated the lecture. Miss Chen is actually correct to focus on the mathematical principles, Professor Krell said, his tone careful. Understanding theory. Theory is what species without natural weapons use to convince themselves they're warriors, Drex said. He was standing now, his full height deliberately displayed. Humans spent millennia killing each other with primitive tools because they weren't born with proper claws or strength. Then they got to space and discovered what real warrior species look like. He took a step toward Nora's row. Must be disappointing, realizing you're obsolete. Nora set down her stylus with a kind of deliberate precision that might have warned a more observant predator. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her posture had shifted in ways the Kraythen dominance-focused social training didn't recognize. Drex, return to your seat, Professor Krell said, his skin patterns shifting toward warning colors. We're discussing tactical theory, not comparative species physiology. But shouldn't combat training include realistic assessments? Drex's tone was reasonable, which made it worse. If humans are going to attend warrior academies, they should understand their limitations. It's educational. He was closer now, towering over Nora's seat. Chen, tell the class, honestly, do you actually believe you could survive 60 seconds against a real warrior? Not in theory, in practice. The silence had weight now. Several students shifted uncomfortably. A few looked away. The Helkari beside Nora had pulled his wing arms in, distancing himself from the confrontation. The other two humans in class were suddenly very focused on their tablets. Nora looked up, meeting Drex's eyes for the first time. Is this a theoretical question, or are you actually curious? It was the wrong thing to say, or possibly the right thing depending on your perspective regarding inevitable violence. Drex's expression shifted from contemptuous amusement to something hungrier. He'd been challenged, in front of witnesses, by a soft-worlder who should have known better. I'm offering education, he said. Practical demonstration. You spend all this time taking notes about momentum and vectors and theoretical combat. But you've never actually felt what it's like when a real warrior decides you're prey. His forearms spread slightly, a Kraythen gesture that signaled dominance challenge. Professor, I believe hands-on learning would benefit the class. A single exchange demonstration. I'll show proper momentum exploitation using an appropriately sized training dummy. Several students made sounds that might have been laughs or sharp intakes of breath. Professor Krell's skin had gone completely dark, which in Vorrax body language indicated profound displeasure bordering on rage. But he was trapped by academy politics and his own exhaustion. Refusing would mean filing reports, dealing with Drex's family connections, and ultimately accomplishing nothing because next week would bring the same behavior. A single exchange, he said finally, in the practice circle. And Drex, if you cause injury requiring more than basic medical attention, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of the semester in remedial ethics training. Drex's smile showed far too many teeth. Of course, Professor. Just a gentle demonstration. The practice circle was a 10-meter diameter ring of slightly elevated duracrete, marked with holographic boundary lines that flickered red if anyone crossed them. It existed for exactly this purpose, allowing students to settle disputes through controlled violence. Because the Academy's founders had understood that young warriors prevented from fighting each other would find worse outlets. The class rearranged themselves around the circle's perimeter, tablets raised to record. This would be shared across the station by evening. Drex entered the circle like he was walking into an arena, all performance and casual confidence. He rolled his massive shoulders, flexed all 4 arms in sequence, and settled into a Kraythen combat stance that emphasized reach and power. His species' pre-combat ritual involved a series of aggressive postures meant to trigger fear responses in opponents. He ran through them all, taking his time, ensuring everyone understood the mismatch they were about to witness. Nora stepped into the circle without ceremony. She wore the Academy's standard training suit, form-fitting smart fabric that monitored vitals and provided minimal impact protection. On her frame, it looked almost comical next to Drex's bulk. She didn't take any particular stance, just stood with weight balanced, hands loose at her sides, breathing steady and controlled. The contrast was stark enough that several students shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't going to be a fight. It was going to be a lesson in the consequences of overconfidence, with Nora playing the role of cautionary example. Professor Krell had moved to the circle's edge, his tentacles positioned over the emergency stop controls. Single exchange on my mark. Any technique is permitted short of lethal force. The exchange ends when one combatant yields, exits the circle, or is rendered unable to continue. He paused, his skin patterns conveying doubt about this entire situation. Combatants ready? Drex settled deeper into his stance, all 4 arms positioned to grab, strike, and control. Ready. Nora's expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes had gone distant and calculating. Ready. Begin. Drex lunged forward with the kind of explosive speed that 8 feet of pure muscle could generate, all 4 arms reaching to grab and immobilize. His strategy was simple because it had always worked. Overwhelm with size and strength, establish physical dominance, end the confrontation before it began. He'd done this to dozens of smaller opponents. It was muscle memory. What happened next occurred in the span of 1.3 seconds, though different observers would argue about the exact sequence for weeks afterward. Nora moved, not backward, which was what Drex expected, not to the side in a desperate dodge. She moved forward and slightly down, dropping her center of gravity while stepping inside Drex's reaching arms with the kind of timing that suggested she'd calculated his speed, reach, and commitment point before he'd even begun moving. Her left hand struck upward, open palm driving into the nerve cluster where Drex's lower right arm connected to his torso. A point that Kraythen combat training specifically protected because it was a known weakness. The strike was precise enough to disrupt the nerve signals controlling that entire arm, which immediately went numb and useless. But Nora was already moving, using Drex's own forward momentum against him. Her right hand had caught his lower left wrist during his lunge, and now she twisted, applied leverage at an angle that Kraythen joints weren't designed to resist, and used his mass and velocity to redirect him downward. This was the momentum exploitation that Professor Krell had been discussing. In Earth's gravity, throwing 800 pounds of aggressive alien would have required strength Nora didn't possess. But she wasn't trying to lift him. She was guiding his existing momentum along a new vector, using his weight against him. Drex's upper arms tried to adjust, to catch himself or grab her. Nora's response was surgical. She drove her knee into the equilibrium organ cluster located behind the Kraythen jaw ridge, a feature that their armor specifically protected in combat situations, but which remained vulnerable in training scenarios. The impact wasn't powerful enough to cause permanent damage, but it was precise enough to temporarily disrupt the biological gyroscope that kept Kraythen balanced. Suddenly, Drex's own nervous system was reporting that he was falling in 3 different directions simultaneously. His upper arms, instead of grabbing Nora, grabbed at empty air in confused reaction. His legs, receiving conflicting signals from his disrupted equilibrium organs, failed to compensate for his redirected momentum. He went down hard. The impact when 800 pounds of confused Kraythen hit Duracrete made a sound like a small vehicle collision. Drex's head bounced once, his species' thick skull plating preventing serious injury, and his limbs splayed out in the uncoordinated sprawl of someone whose brain was no longer certain which direction was up. Nora had already stepped back, hands returning to loose readiness position, breathing barely elevated. The classroom was silent enough to hear the station's life support systems humming in the walls. Drex made a sound between a groan and a confused growl. Tried to rise, discovered his equilibrium was still processing contradictory information, and settled for rolling onto his side while his vision stopped rotating. One of his arms was still numb. His pride was shattered beyond any recovery. Professor Krell's skin had gone through approximately 7 different pattern sequences before settling on something that might have been respect, mixed with profound concern for the administrative headache this was going to cause. He approached the circle slowly, his experienced tactical mind replaying what he'd just witnessed. "Drex, remain still until medical confirms you're cleared," he said. Then he turned to Nora, who was calmly exiting the circle as if she'd just finished a routine exercise. "Miss Chen, where exactly did you train?" "Earth, sir. Taipei Combat Academy. 4 years. Gravity? 1.4 Earth standard at the training facility." Professor Krell's tentacles twitched in a Vorrax gesture that indicated sudden understanding. "Of course. You've been operating under heavier gravity than station standard this entire time." He looked at the circle, where Drex was slowly, carefully sitting up with the expression of someone reconsidering major life choices. "And you studied Earth combat systems. Which ones?" "Primary focus was a synthesis approach, sir. Elements from approximately 15 different historical martial traditions adapted for combat against larger opponents in variable gravity." "Synthesis approach," Professor Krell repeated. His skin patterns had settled into something that conveyed grim amusement. "Which means you've spent 4 years training specifically to fight opponents who outsize, outreach, and outmuscle you." "Yes, sir." "And the Kraythen equilibrium organ vulnerability?" "Covered in xenobiology prerequisites, sir. All major species physiological weak points are standard curriculum for Earth combat programs." Professor Krell's tentacles writhed in what might have been laughter. "Of course they are." He raised his voice to address the class, most of whom were still processing what they'd witnessed. "Attention! What you just observed was a textbook demonstration of the momentum exploitation principles I was attempting to teach before we were interrupted. Miss Chen successfully used her opponent's mass, speed, and overconfidence against him. She struck 2 critical vulnerability points with precision timing, and she accomplished this against an opponent with 4 times her mass and twice her reach." He paused, letting that sink in. "Questions?" The silence stretched. Finally, Vortek, one of Drex's usual supporters, raised a tentative claw. "But humans are soft-worlders. They're not warriors." Professor Krell's skin flashed a pattern that conveyed something between pity and contempt. "Humans spent 10,000 years developing weapons and combat systems because they weren't apex predators on their homeworld. They evolved on a planet with dangerous megafauna, hostile climate extremes, and thousands of competing tribal groups. They didn't develop natural weapons, so they made artificial ones. They didn't develop natural armor, so they studied where to hit unarmored targets for maximum effect. And they kept meticulous records of everything that worked." He gestured to Nora with one tentacle. Miss Chen's species has documented combat techniques going back 5,000 years. They wrote manuals. They tested theories. They refined applications across hundreds of different fighting systems. While our warrior species were relying on instinct and natural advantages, humans were turning violence into an academic discipline. The implications were settling over the classroom like a slowly descending weight. Several students were looking at the other two humans present with new wariness. Drex had finally made it to his feet, though he was keeping one hand on the wall for balance. His face held the expression of someone who just had a fundamental assumption about the universe shattered. He looked at Nora with something that might have been respect, might have been fear, might have been the beginning of understanding that size wasn't everything. He started, his voice rough. He seemed to be searching for words in a situation where his usual vocabulary of dominance and contempt had suddenly become inadequate. I apologize for everything. The comments, the challenge, all of it. Nora nodded once, accepting the apology with the same neutral expression she'd maintained throughout. Accepted. Professor Krell's skin patterns shifted to something approximating satisfaction. Drex, you will report to medical for a full check. Then you will file a formal apology with the Academy administration. Then you will write a 5,000-word analysis of what went wrong with your tactical approach in that exchange, with particular focus on assumption-based strategy failure. Yes, sir. And Drex? This happened because you turned a classroom into a dominance display arena instead of treating it like what it is. A place to learn from people who know things you don't. Miss Chen knows things you don't. Every student in this room knows things you don't. That's why we're here. The professor's tentacles arranged themselves in a gesture that carried disappointed authority. You're dismissed. Take Vortex and Krax with you to medical. The rest of you, return to your seats. We still have 40 minutes of lecture to cover, and apparently some of you need a refresher on why studying theoretical principles might be more valuable than you assumed. The class rearranged itself with far less noise than usual. Drex limped out with his supporters, his usual swagger completely absent. The other students gave Nora a notably wider berth as she returned to her seat, though now it seemed more like respect than avoidance. The Helkari beside her had pulled his wing arms in tight, suddenly concerned about crowding her space. Professor Krell resumed his lecture on momentum exploitation with renewed enthusiasm. And for the first time in 6 weeks, students actually took notes. The holographic displays showed the same ship-to-ship boarding scenarios. But now students were paying attention to vectors, leverage points, and the ways smaller forces could exploit larger opponents' assumptions. Nora returned to annotating her tablet, her stylus moving across the screen in the same steady rhythm as before the interruption. She changed nothing about her demeanor or approach. She simply existed in the space with the same focused competence she'd displayed from day one. The difference was that now, everyone else had adjusted their assumptions to match reality. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to classroom dynamics. Drex attended lectures but participated minimally, his earlier commentary and disruptions replaced by a kind of watchful silence. He'd switched seats to the back row, no longer occupying the prime territory near the front where dominant students traditionally positioned themselves. His 3 friends had scattered to different areas of the room, the social alliance apparently dissolved by shared humiliation. Other students who'd been targets of casual intimidation began showing up in person rather than remotely. The Quellan who'd previously sat silent through lectures started asking questions. A Helkari student who'd been mocked for preferring tactical analysis over physical combat began contributing to discussions without the usual chorus of dismissive sounds. The two other human students, Marcus and Lynn, had started attending in person again. They'd positioned themselves near Nora, but not conspicuously so. And the three had developed the kind of quiet coordination that came from being a minority population in an environment that hadn't quite decided whether to respect or resent them. Professor Krell had adapted his teaching style, incorporating more practical demonstrations and encouraging students to question assumptions about species-based combat advantages. His skin patterns had settled into colors suggesting cautious optimism, though he kept a close watch on potential conflicts. The recording of the incident had indeed spread across the station by evening, then across the entire Academy network by the following day. It had spawned countless debates in dormitories, training halls, and the kind of informal student gatherings where reputations were made and destroyed. The soft-worlders had gained sudden social currency. The warrior species were recalibrating their hierarchies, and somewhere in the Academy's administrative offices, several department heads were having urgent discussions about curriculum updates. 3 weeks after the incident, during a lecture on exploiting opponent assumptions in asymmetric warfare, Professor Krell paused mid-demonstration. "Miss Chen, given your practical experience with this topic, would you care to provide analysis?" Nora looked up from her notes, considered for a moment, and stood. The classroom had gone attentive in ways that would have seemed impossible 2 months ago. "Most combat training focuses on maximizing your strengths," she said. "But that assumes symmetric warfare. Opponents with similar capabilities fighting on roughly equal terms. Asymmetric warfare is about exploiting the gap between what your opponent expects and what you actually are. You let them build a mental model of the fight based on obvious factors like size, strength, or armament. Then you attack the model instead of matching force with force." She pulled up a holographic display, manipulating it to show a Kraythen combat stance. Example: Kraythen fighting strategy is built around overwhelming physical advantages. 4 arms, extended reach, superior strength. They train to use these advantages against opponents who will try to match them in direct confrontation. But they don't train extensively against opponents who refuse to engage on those terms. Drex, in his back row seat, had gone very still. "So you study the stance," Nora continued. "You identify which assumptions are built into it. The wide base assumes the opponent will push back against superior strength. The extended arms assume the opponent will try to maintain distance. The elevated guard assumes the opponent will target the upper body because that's where Kraythen natural armor is weakest." She adjusted the hologram to highlight the equilibrium organs. But assumptions create blind spots. The Kraythen stance doesn't heavily protect lower body nerve clusters or equilibrium organs because their combat doctrine assumes these aren't primary targets. Professor Krell's skin had gone bright with interest. Because Kraythen typically fight other Kraythen, or species with similar approaches. Exactly. Earth combat systems developed differently. We fought each other for millennia with constantly evolving tactics. One group would develop a dominant strategy, then someone else would develop the counter strategy, which would become dominant until someone countered that. We didn't have natural weapons or armor, so we got creative about vulnerabilities. We documented everything. We cross-referenced. We tested theories. She closed the hologram. By the time we reached space, we had thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to fight bigger, stronger opponents. We just needed to fill in alien biology details. A Vorrax student raised a tentacle. "But doesn't this assume your opponents are operating on instinct rather than training?" "Training can become instinct," Nora replied. "If you practice the same responses for years, they become automatic. That's valuable in symmetric combat. You'll react faster than you can think. But it's a vulnerability in asymmetric combat because your automatic responses might be exactly what your opponent is counting on. She paused. The real advantage isn't in having better training. It's in having different training that your opponent hasn't adapted to yet. The class continued with unprecedented engagement, students actually debating tactical theory instead of sizing each other up for dominance challenges. Professor Krell looked like he might be experiencing something resembling job satisfaction, which for a combat instructor was basically euphoria. After class, as students filed out, Drex approached Nora with the careful body language of someone who'd learned hard lessons about assumptions. Chen, a moment? Nora paused, wary but not defensive. Yes? I've been reviewing Earth combat literature, he said. Your species has an extensive doctrine on what you call martial arts. Multiple competing systems, all claiming superiority. That's accurate. Why so many systems? Why not determine which is most effective and focus on that? Nora considered the question. Because most effective depends on context. Some systems work better in certain gravity levels. Some are optimized for armed versus unarmed combat. Some assume multiple opponents. Some focus on competition rules, others on survival situations. She paused. The diversity isn't a weakness. It means we can adapt training to specific situations rather than forcing every situation to fit one approach. Drex's forearms made a gesture that in Kraythen culture indicated respectful acknowledgement. I requested transfer to Professor Yenshi's Alternative Combat Systems course. It covers Earth martial traditions, among others. I thought. He seemed to be choosing words carefully. I thought it might be educational to learn from species who approached warfare differently than my culture teaches. That's a good choice, Nora said. Yenshi is excellent. Will you... Drex paused. Would you be willing to spar sometime? Properly. In the training facilities with appropriate protocols and supervision. Nora studied him for a moment, seeing something that might have been genuine interest in learning rather than the need to prove dominance. Maybe. After you've completed Yenshi's course and understand what you're asking for. Fair. Drex made another respectful gesture and left. His bearing still diminished from his previous swagger, but less defeated than it had been. Marcus appeared at Nora's side as Drex departed. He's actually trying to learn. Didn't see that coming. People can surprise you, Nora said. Sometimes it just takes the right motivation. By right motivation, you mean getting demolished in front of his peer group? I mean, discovering that the universe is more complex than his previous worldview allowed for. The demolishing was just the teaching method. Lynn joined them, tablet tucked under one arm. The three of us are doing study group tonight for the xenobiology exam. You in? Definitely. Nora shouldered her bag. Though I think half the class is going to be studying Kraythen equilibrium organs after today's lecture. Probably all of them, Marcus said. You basically provided a detailed manual on exploiting warrior species vulnerabilities. Every soft-worlder on station is taking notes. They walked toward the dormitory levels, 3 humans navigating a station designed for species that had spent generations assuming they were the galaxy's natural warriors. Behind them, the classroom emptied of students who were beginning to understand that warrior might be a more complicated concept than they'd been taught. In his office, Professor Krell was updating lesson plans with the kind of enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. Combat theory had suddenly become relevant again, not as abstract mathematics, but as the foundation for understanding why assumptions killed more warriors than enemy weapons. His next lecture series would focus on asymmetric warfare principles, using Earth systems as primary examples. He was going to invite guest speakers from soft-worlder species who developed their own approaches to fighting larger opponents. The Academy was designed to train warriors. What it was finally starting to do was educate them. Station Helios 9 continued its rotation in the neutral zone, housing 15,000 students who were slowly, grudgingly, painfully learning that the galaxy was more complicated than species hierarchies suggested. The Kraythen still dominated social spaces through size and numbers. The Vorrax still plotted 3 moves ahead in every interaction. The warrior species still strutted and postured and occasionally hospitalized each other in training accidents. But in the combat theory classrooms, in study groups mixing species that would never have associated before, in training facilities where students from soft-worlder planets taught interested warriors about leverage and precision, something was shifting. The Academy was discovering that warrior elite might need to mean something more than biggest and most aggressive. In the back of one classroom, Drek sat through Professor Yenshi's lecture on Earth defensive systems, taking careful notes on concepts like minimal force, maximum efficiency, and turning opponent strength into weakness. He was learning, growing, beginning to understand that his species' traditional approaches might benefit from exposure to traditions that had evolved under different pressures. In the front of that same classroom, Nora Chen annotated her tablet with the same focused competence she'd displayed since arrival, unbothered by the attention, unchanged by her new reputation. She was here to learn combat theory and application. Everything else was just noise. The galaxy's self-proclaimed warrior species had built empires on assumptions about natural advantage. They were slowly discovering what humanity had learned millennia ago. Assumptions were just opportunities for people who'd done their homework. And humanity, for all its disadvantages in the natural weapons department, had always been exceptional at homework. The station rotated, the lectures continued, and in classrooms across Helios 9, students were beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, the soft-worlders had been taking notes for a reason. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.